Imagine a man at the top of the world, wealth, power, applause, until a single email rips through his perfect life, dragging a secret from the shadows he can't outrun. What happens when the lights fade and the truth demands a price? Stick around for a journey of honor, sacrifice, and redemption that'll leave you questioning what really matters. Hit that like button and subscribe now. Don't miss a single twist. The chandelier glittered above Alexander Carver like a constellation of captured stars, casting a golden glow over the sea of black ties and sequined gowns below. At 65, the CEO of Carver Entertainment stood at the pinnacle of his empire, a titan in a world he'd clawed his way into from nothing. Tonight, Los Angeles bowed to him. The applause thundered as he stepped onto the stage, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, his tailored suit hugging a frame still broad with the discipline of youth. In his hand, the Entrepreneur of the Decade award gleamed, a heavy, cold testament to 40 years of relentless ambition. But as the cameras flashed, his fingers tightened around something smaller, something older. A scratched fountain pen tucked in his pocket, a relic from a father who died too soon. "Thank you," Alex said into the microphone, his voice steady, deep practiced. "This isn't just an award. It's a promise kept. To myself, to this city, to everyone who believed in me." The lie slipped out effortlessly, polished by years of boardroom speeches. The crowd roared louder, a tidal wave of adoration he'd learned to ride. He smiled, a tight, controlled curve of his lips, and let the lights blind him. For a moment, he could almost believe the emptiness inside was just the weight of success settling in. Backstage, the air was cooler, sharper, scented with champagne and the faint musk of expensive cologne. His assistant, a wiry young man named Ethan, handed him a flute of bubbling gold. "You owned that room, sir," Ethan said, grinning. "They're already calling it the speech of the night." Alex nodded, sipping the champagne without tasting it. "Good. Make sure the press gets the transcript by morning." His tone was clipped, authoritative, a man who'd built a fortress around himself with every word. Ethan scurried off, leaving Alex alone in the shadowed corridor. He leaned against the wall, the cold marble seeping through his jacket, and pulled the fountain pen from his pocket. Its brass body was worn smooth by time, engraved with his father's initials, J.C., a reminder of a man who'd taught him discipline but never lived to see its rewards. Alex traced the letters with his thumb, a ritual he'd kept since the day he'd left Santa Barbara behind, a skinny kid on a midnight bus with nothing but a dream. His phone buzzed, snapping him back to the present. An email, no subject line, from an address he didn't recognize. He frowned, swiping it open with a flick of his finger. The words hit him like a quiet punch to the gut. "You've forgotten the woman who gave up everything for you. Come to Santa Barbara, or the world will know the truth." Below, a single line. "Time's running out, Carver." His breath caught just for a second before he forced it steady again. "I don't let anyone threaten me," he muttered to himself, the words a shield against the tremor in his hand. He read the message again, each syllable sinking deeper. Santa Barbara. The name conjured a ghost he'd buried long ago. Grace, with her soft voice and fierce eyes, the girl he'd loved and left behind. 40 years had passed since he'd walked away, chasing a future too big for a small-town dreamer like her. He'd told himself she'd understood, that she'd moved on. But now, this email, this dagger slipped through the cracks of his armor, suggested otherwise. "Who sent this?" he growled under his breath, glancing around the empty corridor as if the sender might step from the shadows. His mind raced, cataloging enemies, rival CEOs, disgruntled ex-partners, journalists hungry for a scandal. Carver Entertainment was a titan, but titans made foes. Yet this felt personal, intimate. A blade aimed not at his company but at the man beneath the title. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, the pen still clutched in his fist, its edges biting into his palm. The memory came unbidden. Grace standing under a street lamp in Santa Barbara, her hair damp from the coastal mist, her hands trembling as she pressed a notebook into his. "Write your stories," she'd said, her voice breaking. "I'll wait." He hadn't looked back as the bus pulled away, the rumble of its engine drowning out her fading figure. He'd convinced himself it was for the best. Her dreams were too small, his too vast. But now, standing in the afterglow of his triumph, that choice felt less like victory and more like a wound he'd ignored too long. Ethan reappeared, breathless. "Sir, the car's ready. Where to?" "The after-party's at the Roosevelt. Everyone's expecting you." His eyes flicked to Alex's face, catching the tightness there. "You okay?" "Fine," Alex snapped, then softened, his tone. "Change of plans. Take me to Santa Barbara, now." Ethan blinked, confused, but nodded and darted off to relay the order. Alex straightened, smoothing his jacket, the mask of control sliding back into place. He wouldn't let this unravel him, not yet. Whatever this email meant, whoever had sent it, he'd face it on his terms. He'd built an empire by staying calm, by outthinking his opponents. This would be no different. As the limo glided through the glittering streets of Los Angeles, Alex stared out at the city he'd conquered. The skyline sparkled, a monument to his will, but tonight it felt distant, hollow. He turned the fountain pen over in his fingers, its weight a tether to a past he couldn't outrun. Grace. What had she given up for him? And why, after all these years, did someone care enough to drag it into the light? The car turned onto the highway, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. Alex closed his eyes, the email's words echoing in his mind. "Time's running out, Carver." For the first time in decades, he wasn't sure what he was racing toward, or what he'd find when he got there. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let it break him. Not now. Not ever. The highway stretched out before Alexander Carver like a ribbon of shadow, the headlights of his limo slicing through the night as they wound toward Santa Barbara. The city lights of Los Angeles faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the quiet hum of coastal darkness. At 65, Alex was no stranger to late-night drives. Decades of deal-making had taught him to thrive in the stillness, but this felt different. The fountain pen rested heavy in his pocket, its brass edges pressing against his thigh, a silent companion to the questions gnawing at him. Who had sent that email? What truth waited in Santa Barbara? And why, after 40 years, did it still matter? The car slowed as they entered the outskirts of the town, its streets lined with quaint bungalows and swaying palms. Ethan, perched in the front seat, glanced back. "Address is up ahead, sir. You sure about this? It's late." His voice carried a hint of unease, but Alex waved it off with a curt nod. "Just drive." Ethan obeyed, guiding the limo to a stop outside, a modest wooden house, its porch light casting a warm glow over a garden bursting with roses and lavender. Alex stepped out, the cool sea breeze tugging at his jacket, and paused. The sight hit him like a half-forgotten melody. Simple, unassuming, a world away from the glass towers he'd built. Through the window, he saw her. Grace. She stood by the sink, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, her hands moving with quiet purpose as she tended to a pot of tea. At 63, she was still striking, those fierce green eyes he remembered, softened now by time, and a frame that carried the strength of someone who'd weathered more than she'd ever admit. She turned, catching his silhouette in the glass, and for a moment their gazes locked. No surprise flickered across her face, only a faint, knowing smile. She opened the door before he could knock. "Alexander Carver," she said, her voice low and steady, the kind that could calm a storm. "I'd say it's a surprise, but I heard about your award. Congratulations." She stepped aside, gesturing him in. The air inside smelled of chamomile and old wood, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of his life. Alex hesitated, then crossed the threshold, his polished shoes sinking into a faded rug. "I'm not here to talk about the award," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. He softened it, adding, "You look well, Grace." She didn't respond, just moved to the stove, pouring tea into 2 chipped mugs. Her hands, roughened by years of work, trembled slightly as she handed him one. He took it, the warmth seeping into his palms, and sat at her small kitchen table, feeling oddly out of place in his tailored suit. "So," Grace said, settling across from him. "Why are you here? After 40 years, I doubt it's for tea." Her eyes met his, unflinching, and he saw it again. That quiet fire, the same resolve that had once dared him to dream bigger than Santa Barbara could hold. He pulled the phone from his pocket, opened the email, and slid it across the table. "This came tonight. Someone knows about us. About me leaving. They're threatening to tell the world unless I came here." Grace read the message, her expression unchanging. She set the phone down gently, like it was something fragile, and took a slow sip of her tea. "And you think I sent it?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with something he couldn't place. Amusement maybe, or pity. "No," he said quickly. "But you're the only one who'd know what it means. Grace, what did you give up for me? That's what it says. What does it mean?" His words hung between them, heavy with the weight of decades unspoken. She looked away out the window at the garden, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "I gave up what I had to," she said finally, her tone soft but firm. "You had your stories, Alex. I had mine. I let you go because I believed in you, more than you ever believed in yourself." She paused, then added, "I don't regret it." The words cut deeper than he'd expected. He remembered her back then, Grace with her notebooks full of half-written articles, her dreams of being a journalist, her laughter as they'd sat under an oak tree plotting scripts for films that never got made. He'd left her behind, telling himself she'd find her own way. But now, sitting in her kitchen, he saw no trace of that ambition, just a woman who'd carved out a quiet life while he'd built an empire. "I promised I'd come back," he said, his voice low, almost a confession. "I didn't." She nodded, as if she'd long accepted that truth, and stood to refill the kettle. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft clink of porcelain and the distant crash of waves. "You don't owe me an apology," she said, her back to him. "I made my choices too, but if someone's digging up the past, it's not me. I've kept it buried all these years." She turned, her eyes locking onto his again. "Why did you come, Alex? To protect your name, or because you finally wondered what you left behind?" He didn't answer right away. The question stung, peeling back the layers of control he'd worn like armor. He'd come because of the threat, yes, because no one challenged Alexander Carver and walked away unscathed. But now, sitting here, he felt something else. A flicker of doubt, a whisper that maybe his empire wasn't the whole story. He sipped the tea, its bitterness grounding him, and said, "I don't know yet, but I'll find out who sent it. And why." Grace smiled again, faint and sad. "Be careful what you dig for, Alex. Some truths don't care about your spotlight." She moved to the window, looking out at the night, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the porch light. He watched her, the woman he'd once loved, and felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself, a wall that had kept him safe, but alone. As he stood to leave, the email's words echoed in his mind. The woman who gave up everything. Whatever Grace had sacrificed, he'd uncover it. Not for the sender, not for the press, but for the man he might still become, if it wasn't too late. The night air in Santa Barbara carried the tang of salt and the whisper of waves, a soothing rhythm that clashed with the storm brewing inside. Alexander Carver. He stood on Grace's porch, the warmth of her tea still lingering in his hands, her words echoing in his ears. Some truths don't care about your spotlight. He'd left her house with more questions than answers. The fountain, pen in his pocket, a quiet anchor as he stepped into the darkness. The limo waited at the curb, its sleek black frame a stark intruder in this sleepy town, but Alex waved Ethan off. "I'll walk," he said, his voice firm despite the late hour. He needed the space, the solitude, to think. The streets were quiet, lined with low fences and glowing porch lights, a world so far removed from the glittering chaos of Los Angeles that it felt like stepping into a memory. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, a steady beat to match the thoughts circling his mind. Grace had given up something for him, something big enough to haunt her, big enough for someone to use against him. But what? And who? The email had been a grenade, its pin pulled, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the explosion was coming. His phone buzzed again, a sharp jolt in the stillness. Another message, this time from a blocked number. "You're here. Good. Now listen. I have proof you abandoned Grace and your son. $10 million wired by dawn, or every headline in America will scream your name by noon." Alex stopped cold, the screen's blue glow illuminating his face. His jaw tightened, but he forced his breathing steady, a discipline honed over decades of boardroom battles. A son. The word hit like a fist, reopening the wound Grace's silence had left. Was it true? Could it be? He typed a quick reply. "Who are you?" and hit send, knowing it was futile. The response came seconds later. "Someone you wronged. Pay up, Carver, or lose everything." A photo followed, a grainy snapshot of Grace, younger, her arms cradling a newborn, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Alex stared, his chest constricting. The baby's face was blurred, but the setting was unmistakable. Santa Barbara General Hospital, a place he'd driven past 1,000 times as a kid. His hands shook, just for a moment, before he clenched them into fists, shoving the phone back into his pocket. Footsteps echoed behind him, deliberate and slow. He turned, his posture rigid, to see a man stepping out of the shadows, tall, lean, with a smirk that cut through the night like a blade. "Philip," Alex said, his voice low, controlled. Philip, Grayson, once his partner at Carver Entertainment's fledgling days, now a ghost from a past he'd buried. The man's gray suit was wrinkled, his eyes sharp with a bitterness Alex recognized too well. "Surprised to see me?" Philip's tone was mocking, his hands stuffed casually in his pockets. "You shouldn't be. You've been stepping on people like me for years, Alex. Time someone stepped back." "You sent the email," Alex said, not a question. He kept his stance steady, his gaze locked on Philip's, refusing to let the accusation rattle him. "What's this about, Philip? Money? Revenge?" "Both," Philip replied, his smirk widening. "You remember that deal in '85, the one that launched you and left me with nothing? You humiliated me in front of the board, called me a liability. I've waited a long time to return the favor." He pulled out his own phone, tapping the screen to reveal a folder icon labeled Carver Secrets. "Proof's all here. Letters, photos, hospital records. Grace was too proud to tell you, but I dug it up. Your son's out there and the world's about to know you're a deadbeat." Alex's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. He'd faced down threats before. Hostile. Takeovers, blackmailing rivals. But this was different. This wasn't just about his empire. It was about the man he'd been, the choices he'd made. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice a quiet steel. "I don't pay off cowards who hide behind shadows." Philip laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think this is a negotiation? 10 million, Alex, or I hit send. Every reporter from here to New York will have this by breakfast." He stepped closer, his breath sour with whiskey. "You can't out-talk this one. Not with your fancy suits and your awards." For a fleeting second, Alex felt the old urge to lash out, to crush Philip like he'd crushed every obstacle in his path. But he didn't. He stood taller, his hands unclenching, his face a mask of calm. "You don't define my honor," he said, each word deliberate. "I'll find the truth myself, not because you demand it, but because I owe it to her. Go ahead, Philip. Hit send. I've survived worse." Philip's smirk faltered just for a heartbeat before he shrugged. "Your funeral, Carver. See you in the headlines." He turned and melted back into the night, leaving Alex alone under the faint glow of a street lamp. The air felt heavier now, the weight of Philip's threat pressing down. But Alex didn't move. He pulled the fountain pen from his pocket, rolling it between his fingers, its familiar heft grounding him. Grace had a son. His son. The possibility gnawed at him, a shard of guilt lodged deep. He remembered her words from earlier. "I let you go because I believed in you." Had she believed enough to shield him from this, to carry it alone all these years? The thought burned, not with anger, but with a quiet ache he hadn't felt in decades. He started walking again, back toward Grace's house, his steps measured, purposeful. Philip could have his headlines. Alex wouldn't stop him with fists or bribes. He'd face this the way he'd built his life, with control, with dignity, with the strength to look at the man he'd been and decide who he'd become. The night stretched ahead, dark and uncertain. But for the first time in years, Alex felt something stir beneath the armor, a flicker of resolve, not for his empire, but for the truth he'd left behind. The walk back to Grace's house felt longer than it should have, each step a measured beat against the pavement, the night air thick with the scent of salt and roses. Alexander Carver's mind churned, Philip's threat looping through his thoughts like a broken reel, a son, a scandal, a past he couldn't outrun. The fountain pen in his pocket pressed against his chest, a steadying weight as he climbed the porch steps and knocked on Grace's door. The light inside still burned, soft and warm, and when she opened it, her green eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, or resignation. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Her voice was gentle, but there was a weariness in it, a threadbare edge Alex hadn't noticed before. He didn't answer, just followed her into the kitchen where the tea mugs still sat on the table, their contents cold. Grace moved to the sink, rinsing them with slow, deliberate motions, her back to him. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of what he'd come to ask. "Philip Grayson found me tonight," Alex said finally, his tone low but firm. "He says you had my son. He's got proof. Photos, records. He wants 10 million to keep it quiet." He watched her closely, searching for a crack in her composure, but Grace didn't flinch. Her hands stilled under the water, then resumed their task, the clink of porcelain against the sink the only sound. "Philip always had a nose for dirt," she said at last, turning off the faucet. She dried her hands on a faded towel, her movements unhurried, and faced him. "What do you want from me, Alex? Confirmation? A denial?" Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching, and for a moment he saw the girl she'd been. Fierce, unyielding, the one who'd believed in him when he'd barely believed in himself. "The truth," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a plea. "I need to know, Grace. Did you?" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Did we have a son?" She held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed, a sound so soft it barely reached him. "Come with me," she said, brushing past him toward a narrow staircase in the hall. He followed, his heart thudding against his ribs, each creak of the wooden steps amplifying the tension coiling inside him. She led him to the attic, a cramped space lit by a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the faint light, and the air smelled of old paper and time. Grace knelt by a stack of boxes, pulling one free, a small, battered thing sealed with yellowed tape. She hesitated, her fingers lingering on the lid, then handed it to him. "Open it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex took it, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt building. He peeled back the tape, the sound sharp in the stillness, and lifted the lid. Inside was a life he'd never known. Letters, dozens of them, written in Grace's neat sloping hand, addressed to him but never sent. Photos spilled out, a young Grace, her face pale and drawn, cradling a newborn. In a hospital bed, a grainy Polaroid of the same child, a boy with dark hair and Alex's sharp jawline, laughing in a park. At the bottom, a birth certificate. Daniel James Carter, born October 12, 1985. Mother listed as Grace Carter. The father's name was blank. Alex sank to his knees, the box trembling in his grip. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw, breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. "Because you were gone," she said simply. "You left that summer, Alex, with your dreams and your promises. I found out I was pregnant a month later. I wrote to you, every week for a year, but I couldn't send them. You were building something bigger than us, and I didn't want to be the chain that held you back." He stared at the photo of the boy, Daniel, his son, and the ache in his chest spread, a quiet fire consuming the walls he'd built. You gave him up, he said. Not an accusation, just a fact pieced together from Philip's photo and the emptiness of her house. I did, Grace admitted, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. I couldn't raise him alone, not the way he deserved. I gave him to a family in Monterey, good people who could give him what I couldn't. I wanted you to be free, Alex, to be the man you dreamed of, not a father trapped in Santa Barbara with a woman like me. The words hit harder than Philip's, threats sharper than any headline could. Alex set the box down, his hands clenching into fists, then unclenching as he forced himself to breathe. He wanted to shout, to demand why she'd carried this alone, but he didn't. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the strength it had taken, the sacrifice she'd made without asking for anything in return. You should have told me, he said, his tone soft but firm. I had a right to know. Maybe, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But I loved you too much to ruin you. And I loved him too much to keep him in a life I couldn't build. She reached out, her hand, brushing his, a fleeting touch that carried decades of unspoken pain. I don't regret it, Alex. I just hope he's happy. He pulled back, standing abruptly, the attic suddenly too small, too suffocating. The truth was a weight he couldn't shrug off, a son he'd never known, a life he'd shaped without ever touching it. Philip could have his 10 million, Alex wouldn't pay. But this was bigger than money or headlines. It was about the man he'd been, the one who'd walked away, and the one he might still become. I'll find him, he said, more to himself than to her, his voice resolute. Not for Philip, not for the press, for me, for us. Grace nodded, her eyes following him as he descended the stairs, the box left open behind her like a wound laid for. The night waited outside, dark and vast, but Alex stepped into it with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Whatever came next, he'd face it, not with anger, not with fear, but with the dignity he owed to the woman by the window and the son he'd never held. The drive back to Los Angeles was a blur of headlights and silence, the hum of the limos, engine a steady counterpoint to the chaos swirling in Alexander Carver's mind. Grace's attic had cracked him open, spilling truths he couldn't unsee. A son named Daniel, a life surrendered, a debt he'd never known he owed. The fountain, pen in his pocket, felt heavier now, its brass edges a quiet reminder of the father he'd lost, and the father he'd failed to be. As the city skyline loomed ahead, glittering like a crown of thorns, Alex steeled himself. Philip's threat wasn't a bluff anymore, it was a fuse already lit. By morning, the headline screamed, CEO Carver's secret shame, abandoned family. For fame, blared one tabloid. The words splashed across a photo of Grace, younger, weary, holding a baby. Another ran a grainy shot of Alex accepting his award, captioned, A Titan's Fall. The news hit Carver Entertainment's headquarters like a storm. The glass tower swarmed by reporters before Alex's car even pulled up. He stepped out, his suit immaculate, his face a mask of calm, and faced the onslaught. Flashlights erupted, a blinding barrage, their clicks and shouts a relentless assault. Mr. Carver, did you abandon your child? Is this why you've stayed single all these years? What does Carver Entertainment say about its CEO's past? Alex raised a hand, silencing the crowd with a gesture honed over decades of command. I'll make a statement when I'm ready, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. Until then, I have work to do. He pushed through, his stride deliberate, the fountain pen clutched in his pocket as an anchor. Inside, the lobby gleamed, marble floors, modern art, a fortress of his own making, but today it felt like a cage. Ethan met him at the elevator, his face pale. Sir, the board's in a panic. Stock's down 5% already. They want a meeting. Now. Alex nodded, stepping into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft hiss. Alone for a moment, he leaned against the wall, the cold steel grounding him. He could feel the weight of every eye in that building, every whisper questioning the man they'd revered. But he didn't falter. He'd built this empire with control, with dignity. He wouldn't let it crumble under gossip. The boardroom was a battlefield of suits and stern faces, the long oak table a silent judge. Margaret, his COO, spoke first, her voice sharp. "Alex, this is a disaster. We need damage control, press release, denial, something. You can't just ignore this." Others nodded, their murmurs a rising tide. Alex stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, and let them talk. When the room quieted, he spoke. "I won't deny the past," he said, his tone even, unyielding. "There's a truth here, and I'm finding it, but I won't let rumors dictate who I am or what this company stands for. You trusted me to lead. Trust me now." His eyes swept the room, meeting each gaze, and the tension shifted. They didn't argue. Not yet. Back in his office, Alex sank into his chair, the city sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from PR, emails from investors. But he ignored them, pulling out the photo Grace had given him. Daniel, a boy with his jawline, his intensity. Where was he now? Who had he become? The questions gnawed, but Alex pushed them down, focusing on the next step. He'd told Grace he'd find him, not for Philip, not for the press, but for himself. A knock broke his reverie. Ethan ushered in a man, mid-30s, lean, with dark hair and a journalist's sharp eyes. "Daniel Carter, from the Chronicle," Ethan said, then stepped out. Alex froze, the name a jolt through his spine. Daniel. His Daniel? The man stood across the desk, notebook in hand, his expression cool but curious. "Mr. Carver," Daniel began, his voice clipped, professional. "I'm here about the story. The world wants to know, did you abandon your family to build this?" He gestured at the office, the view, the empire. Alex studied him, the set of his jaw, the flicker of something in his eyes, and felt a certainty settle in. This was his son. The resemblance was undeniable, a mirror of the boy in the attic photos, grown into a man who didn't know him. For a moment, Alex wanted to confess, to spill the truth, to bridge the decades between them. But he didn't. Grace's words held him back. "I hope he's happy." If Daniel didn't know, if he'd built a life free of this shadow, Alex wouldn't shatter it. Not yet. He leaned forward, his hands folded, his voice calm despite the storm inside. "I don't justify my past to anyone," he said, meeting Daniel's gaze. "I made choices, some I regret, some I don't, but I'm not here to plead for absolution. Ask your questions, Mr. Carter. I'll answer what I can." Daniel's pen paused, his eyes narrowing. "You don't seem rattled," he said, a hint of challenge in his tone. "Most men in your shoes would be scrambling, denying, deflecting. Why not you?" "Because I know who I am," Alex replied, his voice steady, resolute. "The headlines can scream all they want. They don't own me." It wasn't bravado. It was the truth, forged in the attic with Grace, tempered by the sun standing before him. Daniel scribbled something, then asked, "Do you regret it? Whatever happened back then?" Alex hesitated, the question piercing deeper than the cameras outside. "Yes," he said finally, the word quiet but firm. "But regret doesn't change the past. It shapes what I do next." Daniel nodded, a flicker of respect, or recognition, crossing his face before he stood to leave. As the door closed, Alex exhaled, the weight of the encounter settling in. He hadn't lost control, hadn't lashed out, hadn't begged. He'd faced his son, unknowingly perhaps, and kept his dignity intact. But the pressure wasn't over. Philip was out there, the press was circling, and Daniel's questions lingered like a spotlight he couldn't escape. Alex turned the fountain pen in his fingers, its familiar heft a lifeline, and resolved to keep going. Not for his empire, but for the man he still might be. The ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel shimmered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers. A constellation of wealth and power gathered for Carver Entertainment's annual gala. Alexander Carver stood at the edge of the crowd, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, his suit pressed to perfection. At 65, he was a master of this stage, the handshakes, the smiles, the calculated nods. But tonight, the spotlight felt like a noose. The headlines had quieted slightly, a lull before the next storm, but Daniel's visit 2 days ago lingered in his mind, a quiet ache beneath the armor. His son, standing in his office asking questions, hadn't known the truth. Alex hadn't told him, not yet. He scanned the room, the fountain pen in his pocket a steadying weight. Investors mingled with actors, their laughter a brittle veneer, over the whispers he knew were circulating. Then he saw him, Philip Grayson, weaving through the crowd like a shark, his gray suit rumpled but his smirk sharp. Alex's grip tightened on the glass, but he kept his face composed, his breathing even. Philip had lit the fuse, now he was here to watch it burn. "Enjoying your party, Carver?" Philip said, sidling up with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He held a phone in one hand, tapping it idly against his palm. "Big night for you. Shame. It might be your last." His voice was low, taunting, meant to provoke. Alex didn't bite. He set the champagne down on a passing tray, folding his hands behind his back, a posture of calm he'd perfected over decades. "What do you want, Philip?" Alex asked, his tone smooth, unshaken. "You've had your headlines. Isn't that enough?" Philip laughed, a harsh bark that drew a few glances. "Not even close. You think a few tabloids can repay what you took from me? That deal in '85, my deal, you stole it, humiliated me, left me with nothing. I've been waiting for this, Alex, and I've got more." He leaned in, his breath sour with liquor. "Grace didn't just give up your kid. I made sure she kept quiet." The words landed like a punch, but Alex didn't flinch. His pulse quickened, a faint tremor in his hands, but he clasped them tighter, his face a mask of steel. "What do you mean?" he asked, each syllable deliberate, his voice low enough to keep the crowd oblivious. Philip's smirk widened, savoring the moment. "Back in '86, I tracked her down. Found her in that little house, still writing those pathetic letters to you. I told her I'd ruin you, leak the pregnancy, tank your startup if she ever breathed a word. She begged me not to. Said she'd stay silent, let you go. I've had her scared all these years, Carver. That's my leverage." He tapped the phone again. "And now it's yours to lose." Alex felt the air shift, a cold clarity cutting through the haze of the gala. Philip hadn't just dug up the past, he'd shaped it, twisted it, used Grace's love as a weapon. The image of her in that attic, her quiet strength, her sacrifice, burned brighter now. She'd carried Daniel alone, not just for him, but because of this man's threats. Anger flickered, hot and sharp, but Alex smothered it. He wouldn't give Philip the satisfaction of a crack in his control. "You're a coward," Alex said, his voice steady, cutting. "You didn't win anything back then. You lost because you couldn't stand on your own. And now you prey on a woman who's stronger than you'll ever be. I'm not paying you a dime, Philip. Do your worst." Philip's eyes narrowed, but before he could retort, a new voice cut in. "Mr. Carver?" Alex turned to see Daniel Carter approaching, his journalist's notepad swapped for a gala ticket, his dark eyes sharp with curiosity. "Mind if I join you?" He glanced at Philip, a subtle challenge in his stance, and Alex felt a jolt. His son, here stepping into the fray without knowing it. Philip recovered quickly, his smirk returning. "Perfect timing. Meet Daniel Carter, Alex, writes for the Chronicle. Maybe he'd like a scoop. Say how you let me scare his mother into giving him up." He laughed, turning to Daniel. "Ask your boss here about Grace Carter. See what he says." Daniel's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Grace Carter?" he repeated, his voice low, probing. He looked at Alex, searching, and for a moment, the room shrank to just the three of them, father, son, and the man who'd torn them apart. Alex held Daniel's gaze, his heart thudding, but his expression unshaken. "Philip's a liar who thrives on others' pain," he said, his tone calm, measured. "I don't play his games. If you've got questions, Daniel, I'll answer them. Later, away from this circus." He turned to Philip, his voice dropping to a steel whisper. "I don't need your threats to define my honor. You've got nothing left to take. Philip's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking under Alex's unflinching stare. "We'll see," he muttered, then slipped back into the crowd, his phone still clutched like a lifeline. Daniel stayed, his eyes lingering on Alex, a quiet intensity in them that mirrored Grace's. "You didn't deny it," Daniel said, his voice soft but pointed. "About Grace Carter. Who is she to you?" Alex hesitated, the truth teetering on his tongue, but Grace's words held him back. "I hope he's happy." He wouldn't unravel Daniel's life, not here, not like this. "Someone I owe more than I can repay," he said finally, his tone heavy with meaning. "If you're digging, Daniel, dig deep. But no, I'm not hiding from what I find." Daniel nodded, a shadow of something, recognition maybe, crossing his right face before he stepped back into the gala's swirl. Alex watched him go, the stage lights overhead casting long shadows across the floor. Philip's twist had changed everything. Grace's silence wasn't just love. It was fear, forced by a man too weak to face his own failures. Alex wouldn't fight with fists or fury. He'd fight with the truth, with the dignity he owed her, and with the resolve to face whatever came next, son or scandal, under his own terms. The press room at Carver Entertainment's headquarters buzzed with a restless energy, a hive of cameras and microphones poised like weapons. Alexander Carver stood at the podium, his suit as crisp as ever, his silver hair catching the harsh lights overhead. At 65, he'd faced rooms like this countless times, hostile takeovers, shareholder rebellions. But today was different. Today the stakes weren't stocks or profits. They were his name, his past, his soul. The fountain pen rested in his pocket, its familiar weight a quiet tether as he looked out at the sea of faces, their questions already sharpening in their eyes. Philip's gala bombshell had ignited a firestorm. The morning papers ran wild. Carver's, ex-blackmailed into silence, CEO's son a secret for decades. The photo of Grace, hollow-eyed and clutching Daniel, was everywhere, a ghost haunting every screen. Alex had spent the night on the phone with Grace, her voice steady through the static. "Do what you think is right, Alex. I'm not afraid anymore." Her words had settled into him, a compass for this moment. He wouldn't let Philip's venom define her or him. The room hushed as he leaned into the microphone, his hand steady on the podium's edge. "Good morning," he began, his voice deep, unshaken. "You're here because of a story about me, about a woman named Grace Carter, and about choices made 40 years ago. I'm not here to deny it. I'm here to tell you the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Alex pressed on, his tone calm, deliberate. "I met Grace when we were kids in Santa Barbara. She believed in me, gave me the courage to dream big, to leave and build something. I left her behind thinking it was for the best. I was wrong. She had my son, Daniel, and gave him up, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved us both enough to let us go. I didn't know until now." The cameras clicked, a staccato rhythm, but Alex didn't flinch. He pulled the fountain pen from his pocket, holding it up for them to see, a small, scratched thing dwarfed by the grandeur of the room. "This belonged to my father," he said, his voice softening. "He taught me discipline, but I forgot what it meant to carry it with honor. Grace didn't. She faced threats, yes, from a man named Philip Grayson, to keep my past buried, to protect me when I didn't deserve it. That ends today." The room erupted, questions flying like arrows. "What about Grayson? Did you pay him off? Where's your son now?" Alex raised a hand, silencing them with the same quiet authority he'd wielded all his life. "Philip tried to blackmail me," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "He wanted money to keep this quiet. I didn't pay. Not because I couldn't, but because I won't let a coward rewrite my story. Grace's strength, her sacrifice. That's the truth, not his lies." He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued, his voice rising with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "I've spent decades building Carver Entertainment, chasing a legacy I thought mattered. But I was wrong about that too. I abandoned a family, not out of malice, but out of blindness. I can't undo that, but I can own it. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO. This company deserves a leader who knows what honor really means. Not power, not headlines, but responsibility to those who matter most. The room exploded again, gasps and shouts overlapping, but Alex stood firm, his hands now folded, the pen back in his pocket. He saw Daniel at the back, half hidden behind a camera crew, his dark eyes wide but unreadable. Their gazes locked for a moment. A father and son, strangers bound by a truth neither had chosen. Alex didn't call him out, didn't wave him forward. Grace's hope for Daniel's happiness held him back. If his son wanted to step into this light, it would be his choice, not Alex's. A reporter near the front stood, her voice cutting through the din. "Mr. Carver, are you saying you're guilty? That you're running from this?" Alex met her eyes, his expression steady, resolute. "I'm not running," he said. "I'm facing it. Guilt doesn't erase the past, it shapes what you do next. I've lived under these lights too long to think they define me. I don't need them to know who I am, or who I owe." He stepped back from the podium, the flashlights flaring like a final salute, and walked off the stage, his stride measured, his head high. Behind him, the narrative shifted. Philip's name surfaced in the questions now, his threats, his blackmail, turning, the tide against him. By noon, reports trickled in. Investors pulling out of his ventures, his credibility crumbling under the weight of his own malice. Alex didn't watch it unfold. He was already in his office packing a single box, photos from his desk, the fountain pen, a life stripped to its essentials. Ethan hovered at the door, his face a mix of shock and admiration. "Sir, you didn't have to do that. The board would have backed you." "I know," Alex said, sealing the box with a strip of tape. "But I didn't build this for them. I built it for me, and I forgot why." He looked out the window at the city he'd conquered, its gleam dulled by the clarity of what he'd lost. "Tell Grace I'll call her tonight. I need to hear her voice." As Ethan left, Alex's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Saw your speech. Mom always said you were a good man deep down. Maybe she was right. D." Alex stared at it, his throat tightening, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. Daniel. His son had seen, had written, had opened a door Alex wouldn't force wider, not yet. He left the office, the box under his arm, the weight of his empire lifting with each step. The flashlights outside flared again, but he walked through them, untouched. He'd given up power, not dignity. Sacrificed the stage, not the man he'd become. For Grace, for Daniel, for himself, he'd spoken his truth. And that, he knew, was honor enough. The sun rose over Santa Barbara in a quiet blaze of gold, spilling across the garden outside Grace's wooden house. Alexander Carver sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee warming his hands, the fountain pen resting beside him on the weathered wood. At 65, he'd traded the glass towers of Los Angeles for this, a small patch of earth where roses bloomed and the air carried the faint hum of the sea. It had been 3 months since his final speech, 3 months since he'd walked away from Carver Entertainment, and the world he'd left behind felt like a distant echo, its clamor softened by the simplicity of this new rhythm. Grace stepped out, her silver hair catching the light, a basket of gardening tools in her arms. She smiled at him, a real smile, not the faint, guarded one from their first reunion, and set the basket down. "You're up early," she said, settling beside him. "Thought you'd sleep in after yesterday." "Couldn't," Alex replied, his voice low, warm. "Too much to think about." Yesterday had been his first class, teaching a group of local kids how to shoot short films, their laughter and curiosity filling the community center he'd funded with his severance. It wasn't the grand stage of a gala or the cold precision of a boardroom, but it felt right, like a piece of himself he'd lost and found again. The press had moved on after his resignation, chasing fresher scandals. Philip Grayson's name faded too, his ventures collapsing under the weight of his exposed blackmail, his threats a hollow shell without Alex's empire to prop them up. Carver Entertainment thrived under new leadership, its stock rebounding, a testament to the foundation Alex had built, even if he no longer stood atop it. He didn't miss it. Not the way he'd thought he would. The lights of Los Angeles had dimmed in his rearview, replaced by the softer glow of this life. Grace reached for a pair of pruning shears, her hands steady now, free of the tremble he'd seen that first night. "You're good with those kids," she said, nodding toward the garden where they'd filmed a shaky scene the day before. "They look at you like you're some kind of hero." "I'm not," Alex said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just an old man trying to make up for lost time." He sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him, and glanced at her. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, Grace. For Daniel. For keeping him safe, even from me." She paused, her shears hovering over a rose bush, then set them down. "You don't owe me, Alex," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I made my choices. You're making yours now, that's enough." She looked out at the garden, her eyes distant but peaceful. "He's happy, you know, Daniel. I saw it in his face when he came by last week." Daniel had visited twice since the speech, each time a quiet step closer. The first was a surprise, a knock on Grace's door, a script in his hand titled "The Woman Who Waited," a story about a mother's strength he'd written for the Chronicle's art section. He hadn't called Alex Dad, hadn't asked about the past, but he'd sat with them, sharing coffee and small talk. His dark eyes, so like Alex's, softening with each visit. The second time, he'd brought a camera, filming Grace as she told stories of Santa Barbara's old days, her laughter ringing through the garden. "He texted me after the speech," Alex said, pulling his phone from his pocket to show her. "Mom always said you were a good man deep down." Maybe she was right. Grace read it, her fingers brushing the screen, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but Alex saw the relief in her smile. "He's got your stubbornness," she said, a teasing lilt in her voice. "And your way with words. I think he's figuring you out, in his own time." "I won't push him," Alex said, his tone resolute. "He deserves to come to me or not on his terms. I've taken enough from him already." He set the mug down, picking up the fountain pen instead, rolling it between his fingers. It was scratched and faded, a relic of a father who'd taught him discipline, but now it felt like more. A bridge to the son he was learning to know, however slowly. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Come help me with these roses," she said, nodding toward the garden. "You can't sit there brooding all day." Alex chuckled, a real laugh, rare and unguarded, and followed her. They worked side by side, the snip of shears and the rustle of leaves filling the morning. His hands, once accustomed to signing contracts and shaking hands with moguls, now found purpose in this, trimming thorns, tending roots, building something small but lasting. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived unannounced, his car pulling up as Alex and Grace finished watering the plants. He stepped out, a camera bag slung over his shoulder, and waved, a casual gesture that carried a quiet weight. "Thought I'd film you two today," he said, his voice easy. "Readers loved Mom's story. They want more." Alex nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Whatever you need," he said, keeping his tone light, though his chest tightened with something like hope. Daniel set up the camera, directing Grace to talk about her garden, her voice weaving tales of resilience and beauty. Alex watched, a silent figure in the background, until Daniel turned the lens on him. "What about you, Alex?" Daniel asked, his tone professional but curious. "What's your story now?" Alex hesitated, the fountain pen, in his pocket, a steady pulse against his heart. "It's simple," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "Honor isn't something you keep, it's something you give. I spent too long chasing the wrong lights. Now I'm here, trying to earn the ones that matter." He glanced at Grace, then at Daniel, and smiled. A real unguarded smile. Daniel lowered the camera, a flicker of something, understanding maybe, crossing his face. "Good answer," he said, and turned back to filming Grace. The moment passed, small but seismic, a step toward a bond Alex wouldn't force but would wait for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a soft glow, Alex sat back. On the porch, the pen in his hand, Grace beside him, Daniel's car fading down the road. The lights of his old life had dimmed, but these, the ones he'd found here, shone brighter. He'd lost an empire, but gained a truth. Dignity wasn't in the spotlight, but in the quiet acts of repair, of love, of giving back, and that he knew was a legacy worth living. And so the spotlight dims, leaving behind not a titan of industry, but a man who learned that true honor isn't forged in wealth or fame. It's built in the quiet moments of repair, love, and giving back. What did his journey stir in you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. If this story moved you, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more tales of grit and grace. See you in the next one.